Welcome back to Educator.com's English Grammar course. This lesson is on sentence fragments. Let's get started. All right, we're going to begin this lesson with a brief overview. We're going to talk about sentence boundaries, which is where fragments actually come from. We're going to talk about phrases and clauses because most sentence fragments are actually disembodied phrases and clauses. And we're going to talk about the different kinds of sentence fragments. The ones that are a subordinate clause, ones that have a missing subject or verb, ones that have a missing subject and verb, and fragments used for effect. There actually is a way to use fragments correctly, and I'll show you what it is. All right, sentence boundaries. Sentences need boundaries. They need punctuation and other techniques to break thoughts down into easily digestible chunks. Humans are easily distracted. We need ways to put our language into little bits so we get it. When there are too many boundaries, sentences end up as fragments. We've broken them down into pieces that are too small, which is where we get the word fragments. When there aren't enough boundaries, sentences end up as run-ons. Now we're going to cover run-ons in our next lesson, but I thought I'd introduce the concept here just so you know there is the other end of the spectrum. All right, we're going to talk about the difference between a phrase and a clause because they make two different kinds of fragments and you fix them in different ways. A phrase does not contain both a subject and a predicate. Now you remember from our lesson on sentence structure that the subject is whatever's performing the action and the predicate is the action they're performing. A phrase is missing one of those, possibly even both. It may contain one or the other, or it may contain neither of them, but it never ever has both. So we have things like to the store, which is a prepositional phrase. It has an object, but no subject, no predicate. We have sleeping soundly, which is participial, but no subject. We have once upon a time. Once again, we have an adverb and a prepositional phrase, but no subject, no predicate. And without saying a word, another prepositional phrase. Now, a clause, unlike a phrase, contains both a subject and a predicate. And there are two different kinds of clauses. There's an independent clause, which expresses a complete thought and can stand alone. So in this case, I went to the store is an independent clause. It could be a sentence all by itself. It has a subject, I. It has a predicate, went to the store. It works perfectly well as a sentence all by itself. It's independent. It doesn't need anything else. A dependent or subordinate clause, we use both names in English, unfortunately, cannot stand alone. It depends on another clause to do this. It begins with a subordinating conjunction or a relative pronoun. Now you'll find those covered in our lessons on conjunctions and pronouns respectively. But for right now, all you need to know is a dependent or subordinate clause depends on something else to work. So, while I was at the store. Well, that could be part of a grammatical sentence, but you can't just walk up to someone on a subway platform and say, while I was at the store. They'll look at you like you're crazy. Ditto if you say, who likes to go shopping? Especially if it's not a question. Who likes to go shopping? You're just going to say, who likes to go shopping? It's a fragment. It's kind of random. It's got a subject, who, it's got a predicate, likes to go shopping, but it really doesn't make a lot of sense by itself. All right, take a look at these examples. See if you can figure out whether each line is a phrase or a clause, and decide whether each clause is independent or subordinate or dependent. Freud divided the mind into three levels: the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is the most important part of our personality, because it allows us to meet our basic needs. Take a good look, pause the video if you need to. And here we are. Freud divided the mind into three levels. That's an independent clause. We have the subject, Freud, and we have the predicate, divided the mind into three levels. There's nothing in it that requires any other part of the sentence to make it make sense. Now we look at the id, the ego, and the superego. That is actually a phrase. It doesn't have a verb. It has a subject, a compound subject in fact, but it does not have a predicate or a verb of any kind. Now, the id is the most important part of our personality. That's also an independent clause. It has a subject, the id, and a predicate is the most important part of our personality, because it allows us to meet our basic needs. That is a dependent clause. It does have a subject and a predicate. It and allows us to meet our basic needs. But you see that because? That is a subordinating conjunction, so we know that this is a dependent clause. All right, so now that we've gone over all these phrases and clauses and we're talking about why they're not sentences, what is a sentence? Let's review quickly. A sentence contains at least one independent clause, so it contains both a subject and a predicate, and it expresses a complete thought. So, I went to the store today. That's a complete thought. It has a subject, it has a predicate, it makes sense. A sentence may include more than one independent clause, as well as one or more dependent clauses or subordinate clauses, and one or more phrases. Let's look at an example. I went to the store today. All right, we know that that is an independent clause. With my sister, we know that that's a phrase, in fact, a prepositional phrase. Who loves shopping? That's a dependent clause. We had a good time. That's an independent clause. So it's a perfectly grammatical sentence, and it has all of these pieces in there. The trouble is when these pieces show up outside of a sentence. All right, when a sentence lacks a subject or predicate, or both, or does not express a complete thought, it is a fragment. It's a broken off piece of a sentence. So, you might have seen this on postcards. Thinking of you. Well, it's a nice sentiment, except it doesn't have a subject. Who's thinking of you? We don't say. This is the problem. Except for the thinking part. Oh, well, that's kind of snide and also a phrase. And the part about you. That's another fragment. None of these could stand alone as an independent thought. Now, let's look at the different kinds of fragments. Sometimes a fragment is a subordinate clause. It has a subject and a verb, but it doesn't express a complete thought. So, in the sentence, in the futuristic society of Brave New World, everyone is happy. Perfectly good sentence. Because they all take a drug called soma. Well, that's a subordinate clause. There's that subordinating conjunction because again. Now, they all take a drug called soma by itself could be a sentence. It has a subject, they, and a predicate, take a drug called soma. But because we've got because right there, it depends on something else, and it can't sit by itself. So, how do you fix that? Well, to fix this, you attach the subordinate clause to an independent clause, or you make the clause independent. What does that actually mean? In the futuristic society of Brave New World, everyone is happy because they all take a drug called soma. Well, now we've just made it one big happy sentence. So this dependent clause, which is so needy and dependent and needs something else to make it happy, well, now it's got that independent clause to make it happy. It's part of the family, it's part of a sentence, it's no longer a fragment, we've glued it onto something. You can also take that fragment and turn it into an independent sentence by removing the subordinating conjunction. In the futuristic society of Brave New World, everyone is happy, end of sentence. They all take a drug called soma. We got rid of the because, it's no longer dependent. It's an independent clause because it has a subject and a predicate, that's what a clause is. And now it makes sense, and we don't have any more fragments. All right, well, that's not the only kind of fragment. Sometimes a fragment is missing either a subject or a verb. These phrases are often participial phrases, or the second part of a compound predicate separated from the rest of the sentence. And again, it's a part of the sentence that stuck out and broke off. Believing that happiness means nothing without unhappiness. Bernard rejects soma. Well, Bernard rejects soma is a perfectly good sentence all by itself, but what's this believing that unhappiness means nothing without believing that happiness means nothing without unhappiness? Well, that believing is the participial form of the verb believe, but we have no idea what the subject is. We have a verb, but no subject. Who does the believing? We don't know. So, we have a fragment. How do you fix it? Okay, to fix this, attach the phrase to an independent clause or add the missing element. So, we could tack it onto this working sentence, Bernard rejects soma, and say, believing that happiness means nothing without unhappiness, comma, Bernard rejects soma. You could also change it to say something like, Bernard believes that happiness means nothing without unhappiness. And then to avoid repetition, you would say in the next sentence, he rejects soma. Either one would work perfectly well. We either add the missing element, add a subject, or we tack it on to an independent clause and make a bigger sentence. All right, sometimes a fragment is missing both a subject and a verb. It's missing both. Man, some days you just can't win. This kind of fragment can be any sort of phrase, any kind of piece that broke off the sentence. In Bernard's world, everyone is predestined to be happy through genetic engineering and psychological conditioning. Well, here's our problem. Through genetic engineering and psychological conditioning. It doesn't have a subject or a verb. It is, in fact, one long prepositional phrase. Through is a preposition. Genetic engineering and psychological conditioning is the object of the preposition. So what do we do? To fix this, attach the phrase to an independent clause or add the missing elements. So we could say, in Bernard's world, everyone is predestined to be happy, no period, no end of sentence, no punctuation, no nothing, through genetic engineering and psychological conditioning. One long sentence. Now it makes sense. All right. Now, here is the point where you actually get to break the rules. Writers may deliberately use fragments for effect. Okay, this is one of those when you understand the rules of English well enough, you learned how to break them. But you have to know the rules before you can break them or you just make a mess. So, writers may use fragments for effect, for emphasis. They may use them for transitions or to answer a question. Okay, these are all perfectly legitimate uses of fragments if you know what you're doing. If you don't do it. This is common in advertising and in interjections. If you think about it, a lot of interjections from our lesson on interjections are just 1 or 2 words long. It'd be pretty hard to have a subject and a predicate in those cases. If the fragment is used on purpose and the technique isn't used too often, this is something you can overuse, don't do that, there's usually no need to correct it. If it's being used well, if it makes sense, and it's not being overused, just leave it. It's fine. Everyone is happy except Bernard. That emphasizes except Bernard, gets you interested in Bernard. Or you could say, first, a fundamental question. Makes sense in context, it's fine. Can we be happy if there is no unhappiness? Probably not. Answers the question we just asked, the meaning is clear, so it's fine. Soma, happiness today, tomorrow, and always. It's an advertising slogan. Again, conveys meaning, happens to be a fragment, but because the person who wrote this knows what they're doing, it makes sense. All right. See if you can find the fragments in this selection and determine what type they are. This brave new world sounds like a scary place because people don't have free will. They are born already predestined to be a plumber or pilot or factory worker and love what they do. Take a good look. Pause the video if you need to. Well, that's a fair number of fragments. There are 2 in this passage. This brave new world sounds like a scary place. Perfectly legitimate sentence, has a subject, predicate, makes sense, all good. Because people don't have free will. Well, this is a dependent clause. It has the subject, people, and a predicate, don't have free will. But there's that because. There's that subordinating conjunction again, so this needs to be attached to something. They are born already predestined to be a plumber or pilot or factory worker. Again, has a subject, has a predicate, makes sense. It's a perfectly good sentence. And love what they do. Well, that has no subject, so that's also a fragment. All right. Let's do a little bit more practice. See if you can find the fragments in this paragraph, and now, this is the more important part, correct them. Make this sentence grammatical and clear. Or this paragraph, rather, grammatical and clear. Francis Ford Coppola's visually stunning and deeply disturbing film, Apocalypse Now. Set in Vietnam during the war, it is an adaptation of Joseph Conrad's 1902 novel, Heart of Darkness, which takes place in the Belgian Congo. Conrad's novel is based on his own experience as a riverboat captain during a time of rampant corruption and slaughter. Take a good look. Pause the video if you need to. Think about what you need. All right. Now, there are a lot of ways to fix fragments, as we've seen in these lessons. This is how I chose to fix these fragments. Francis Ford Coppola's visually stunning and deeply disturbing film, Apocalypse Now, is set in Vietnam during the war. So, we took what was 2 fragments, and we put them together to make a clear sentence. Now, if you'll remember, originally the second sentence in the paragraph was, set in Vietnam during the war, it is an adaptation of Joseph Conrad's 1902 novel, Heart of Darkness. But if you've already tacked on that bit about Francis Ford Coppola at the beginning, this becomes a very long sentence. Remember, a rule of thumb for sentence length is, if you have to take a breath in the middle, it's too long. So, since we've already made that first sentence longer, we have to chop it off and start a new sentence. It, use a pronoun as a subject, because we just removed the subject. It is an adaptation of Joseph Conrad's novel, 1902 novel, Heart of Darkness, which takes place in the Belgian Congo. Now, we had this subordinate clause, which needed to be tacked onto an independent clause in order to make sense. So we've done that. We've taken, it is an adaptation of Joseph Conrad's 1902 novel, Heart of Darkness, independent clause, and we've tacked on the subordinate clause, which takes place in the Belgian Congo. All right, Conrad's novel is based on his own experience as a riverboat captain during a time of rampant corruption and slaughter. Again, this was a prepositional phrase, so it needs to be attached to an independent clause to make sense. We did that by using Conrad's novel is based on his own experiences as a riverboat captain. Now, read the whole thing through, and you'll find it reads much more smoothly, and there are no fragments. Francis Ford Coppola's visually stunning and deeply disturbing film Apocalypse Now is set in Vietnam during the war. It is an adaptation of Joseph Conrad's 1902 novel Heart of Darkness, which takes place in the Belgian Congo. Conrad's novel is based on his own experiences as a riverboat captain during a time of rampant corruption and slaughter. And there you have it. There's how to identify fragments and how to fix them. That's all for this lesson. Thank you for watching Educator.com.